On the evening of March 26, 1883, New York City was a landscape of stark contrasts. A biting sleet fell upon the cobblestones of Fifth Avenue, where the smell of horse manure and coal smoke mingled with the anticipation of a social execution. For decades, the hierarchy of the American elite had been a static, impenetrable monolith governed by Carolyn Schermerhorn Astor. But on this night, the atmospheric pressure of the city's high society shifted. At 665th Avenue, the newly completed Petit Chateau, a neo-Gothic fortress of limestone, glowed with the revolutionary hum of Edison's incandescent bulbs. Alva Vanderbilt was not merely hosting a costume ball, she was conducting a $250,000 siege operation. Adjusted for the purchasing power of 2026, this single evening cost $7,150,000. It remains the most aggressive expenditure for social recognition in American history. The technical logistics of the event were staggering. Alva had commissioned 200 costumes from the House of Worth in Paris, shipped across the Atlantic in pressurized trunks. To ensure the comfort of her guests, she installed an experimental ventilation system that circulated air cooled by 5 tons of ice stored in the basement. A feat of engineering that cost $12,000 in 1883 currency, or roughly $370,000 today. While the city's working class struggled with the repercussions of the 1882 Depression, Alva's ballroom was a vacuum of excess. The menu, curated by a team of 30 French chefs, featured 1,000 pounds of lobster and 200 cases of Perrier-Jouet champagne. Each bottle had been aged in the Vanderbilt cellars for precisely 6 years to achieve the specific acidity required to cut through the richness of the truffled pheasant served at midnight. The tactical heart of the evening lay in the star quadrille. In the 19th century, these choreographed dances were the ultimate metric of social inclusion. Alva had invited Carolyn Astor's daughter, Carrie, to participate in the rehearsals, only to abruptly withdraw the invitation. The reason was a calculated technicality of 19th century etiquette. Since Carolyn Astor had never formally called upon the Vanderbilt home by leaving her engraved calling card on their silver tray, Alva claimed she did not technically know the Astors existed. To Alva, the social laws of the Knickerbockers were a software she could hack with the brute force of her husband's $200 million railroad fortune, equivalent to $6.2 billion in 2026. As the clock struck 11 p.m., the carriage of Alice Vanderbilt, Alva's sister-in-law, arrived. She stepped out wearing the electric light dress, a garment woven with actual silver thread and powered by a hidden battery pack that illuminated a torch held over her head. This was the Gilded Age's version of nuclear deterrence, a display of technological and financial superiority that made Caroline Astor's traditional velvet gowns look like relics of a dead century. While Caroline sat in her somber mansion at 355th Avenue, now the site of the Empire State Building, surrounded by shadows and old Dutch portraits, she realized the gatekeeper had become the prisoner. The world was no longer governed by lineage, but by the speed of the locomotive and the brightness of the filament. To save her daughter from the public humiliation of being excluded from the season's most vital event, Carolyn Astor performed the unthinkable. She ordered her footman to deliver her calling card to the Vanderbilt mansion. It was a formal surrender. The old guard had blinked. The macroeconomic reality of the 1880s, the transition from agrarian land wealth to industrial capital, had finally breached the walls of the ballroom. Carolyn Astor finally sent her calling card to Alva, but she did not know that this small slip of pasteboard was, in fact, her abdication papers. The war for New York was a collision between two distinct species of wealth. To understand the friction, one must examine the molecular structure of their foundations. Carolyn Schermerhorn Astor was the byproduct of the Knickerbocker elite, the Dutch and English settlers who had claimed Manhattan when it was still a colonial outpost. Her father, Abraham Schermerhorn, managed a shipping empire that utilized the packet system, a logistical innovation that allowed ships to depart on fixed schedules regardless of cargo volume. By 1830, the Schermerhorn estate was valued at $1.5 million, roughly $48 million in 2026, all held in prime Manhattan real estate. This was blood money, wealth that had sat in the soil for generations, quiet and stagnant. In 1853, Carolyn married William Backhouse Astor Jr. The Astors had built their empire on the fur trade and the subsequent acquisition of slum properties. By 1860, William's father had amassed a fortune of $50 million, laptings or $1.7 billion today. Their business model was surgically simple. They never sold land. They leased it to builders for 21-year terms, ensuring that the Astors owned the ground while the tenants paid for the improvements. This created a permanent, passive income stream that allowed Carolyn to focus entirely on the engineering of social exclusion. She viewed the city as a private club where membership was determined by the 1811 Commissioner's Map of Manhattan, favoring the established families of the lower wards. Contrast this with Alva Smith Vanderbilt. Born in 1853 in Mobile, Alabama, Alva was the daughter of Murray Smith, a cotton planter whose wealth was erased by the American Civil War and the subsequent collapse of the Confederate bond market. Alva grew up in the ruins of the South, watching her family's status evaporate as the price of cotton plummeted from 25 cents to 10 cents per pound. This trauma forged a woman who viewed wealth not as a heritage, but as a weapon of reclamation. When she married William Kissam Vanderbilt in 1875, she was not looking for a husband. She was looking for a financier for her revenge. William Willie K. Vanderbilt was the grandson of the Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, a man who had transformed a $100 loan into a $100 million shipping and railroad monopoly. The Commodore's strategy was based on horizontal integration, buying every competitor until he controlled the New York Central Railroad, the vital artery for American grain and steel. By 1880, the Vanderbilt family controlled more liquid capital than the United States Treasury. However, to the Astors, this money was unrefined. It smelled of the steam engine and the soot of the tracks. The Vanderbilts were the people from the ferry, a derogatory term referencing the Commodore's humble beginnings as a boatman. The tension between the two women was amplified by the Panic of 1873, an economic contraction that saw 18,000 businesses fail. While the rest of the nation starved, the Astors and Vanderbilt saw their relative power grow as they purchased distressed assets for cents on the dollar. Carolyn Astor used this period to tighten her grip on the 400, a list of families who could trace their wealth back at least 3 generations. She established the Patriarch Balls, where the ticket price was not money, but ancestry. Alva Vanderbilt, however, recognized that the Industrial Revolution was minting new millionaires every month. She saw a market of new money that was being ignored by Carolyn, and she prepared to lead them. Alva did not just want a seat at Caroline's table. She wanted to saw the legs off that table. By the early 1880s, Carolyn Astor had successfully codified the American class system. This was not a vague social hierarchy, but a rigid mathematical construct designed to withstand the rising tide of industrial wealth. The architect of this system was Ward McAllister, a self-appointed arbiter of taste who had spent years studying the courts of Europe. Together they established the 400. Bidun, the number was not an abstraction of excellence. It was a technical limitation dictated by the physical dimensions of Carolyn Astor's ballroom at 350 Fifth Avenue. McAllister famously noted that, "If you go beyond 400, you strike people who are either not at home in a ballroom or else make other people feel not at home." This exclusion was managed through the Patriarch Balls, a series of events where the invitation list was vetted with the precision of a military census. The logistics of an Astor dinner party were a masterclass in the service à la Russe. Unlike the traditional service à la Française, where all dishes were placed on the table simultaneously, the Russian style required each course to be served sequentially by a battalion of footmen. This transition represented a fundamental shift in the domestic economy of the elite. To host a dinner for 30 people under these rules required a minimum of 12 specialized servants, a butler to oversee the wine cellar's temperature, an under-butler to manage the silver, and footmen who were required to be of identical height and build to maintain visual symmetry. The cost of such a meal, featuring rare out-of-season delicacies like hothouse strawberries and Romanov caviar, averaged $1,000 in 1880, approximately $31,000 in 2026 purchasing power. Caroline Astor's annual entertainment budget exceeded $100,000, $3.1 million today, a figure that served as a financial barrier to entry for any family without deep multi-generational reserves. The centerpiece of Caroline's authority was her Beecher diamond necklace. A tectonic display of wealth, the piece consisted of 28 stones of exceptional clarity, with a total weight exceeding 200 carats. In 1885, its valuation stood at $3,000, which scales to a staggering $94,000 in 2026. When Caroline wore this piece, sitting beneath her life-sized portrait by Carolus Duran, she was not merely a hostess, she was a sovereign enforcing a border. The 400 functioned as a closed-loop economy. Membership ensured access to the most lucrative marriage alliances and real estate insider information. To be excluded was to be financially and socially quarantined. The technical enforcement of this quarantine was the visiting card system. A servant at the Astor Mansion would receive a visitor's card on a silver salver. If the name was not on the master list, the card was never moved to the upper drawing room. This was the Gilded Age's version of a firewall. Macroeconomically, the early 1880s saw the U.S. returning to the gold standard, which stabilized the fortunes of land-owning families like the Astors, while making it harder for new money to fluctuate their way into the elite. However, the sheer volume of capital being generated by the railroad and steel industries began to create a pressure that the 350 Fifth Avenue ballroom could no longer contain. Ward McAllister's influence began to wane as he became a figure of public ridicule in the tabloid press, particularly in the Town Topics columns, which detailed the absurdities of the elite's rituals. Caroline Astor remained oblivious to the fact that her fortress was built on the assumption that the world would remain static. She spent her days polishing a legacy that was increasingly out of sync with a city adding 50,000 new residents every year. The list of the 400 was a wall, but Alva Vanderbilt was already installing the dynamite. In 1882, Alva Vanderbilt recognized that to dismantle Caroline Astor's monopoly, she had to invalidate the very ground the Astors stood upon. New York's elite lived in brownstones, austere, uniform structures of Triassic sandstone that emphasized sobriety and lineage. Alva viewed these buildings as drab and intellectually stagnant. She commissioned Richard Morris Hunt, the first American architect to graduate from the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, to build the Petit Chateau at 660 Fifth Avenue. This was not a house. It was a $3 million, $85.5 million in 2026, psychological operation. Hunt utilized Indiana limestone, a material that was significantly more durable and reflective than the porous brownstone of the Knickerbockers. The building's bright, white facade was a deliberate visual rupture in the New York skyline, signaling that the Vanderbilt era would be defined by light and European sophistication rather than Dutch gloom. The engineering of the Petit Chateau introduced technologies that were previously reserved for commercial skyscrapers. Hunt utilized hidden structural steel beams to support the massive weights of the grand staircase, which was carved from solid Caen stone imported from France. The logistics of the construction required the Vanderbilt-owned New York Central Railroad to prioritize the transport of limestone blocks from Bedford, Indiana, directly to the Manhattan docks. The interior featured a great hall that rose 2 stories, designed with acoustic properties that allowed a small orchestra to be heard clearly in every room on the first floor without the need for electronic amplification. Alva oversaw every technical detail, from the specific chemical composition of the mortar to the installation of early Edison incandescent wiring, a luxury that cost $15,000, $430,000 today, and required a dedicated steam generator in the basement. While Alva built her palace, the American economy was transitioning into the long depression of the 1880s. While grain prices fell and labor strikes began to paralyze the Midwest, Alva spent $50,000, $1.4 million today, on a single set of Renaissance tapestries for her dining room. This was architecture as propaganda. It projected an image of invincible stability. Richard Morris Hunt's design drew heavily from the Château de Blois, incorporating late Gothic and early Renaissance elements that suggested the Vanderbilts were the natural successors to the French monarchy. This Gilded Age Renaissance served to bypass the Astors' 200-year history in America by aligning the Vanderbilts with 500 years of European royalty. It was a strategic leapfrog of lineage. The Petit Château forced a relocation of the city's social center of gravity. Suddenly, the Astors' neighborhood began to feel downtown and antiquated. The macro-urban planning of New York shifted north, following the white limestone of the Vanderbilt mansions. Other industrial titans, such as the Goulds and the Rockefellers, took note of Alva's success and began commissioning their own palaces, effectively ending the era of Knickerbocker architectural modesty. By the time the roof was capped with blue slate and copper cresting, 1660 Fifth Avenue had become the most photographed private residence in the world. It was a physical manifestation of Alva's intent to dominate the visual and social landscape of the city through sheer, unadulterated scale. The castle was ready. Now, Alva only needed a pretext for the massacre. Inside the limestone and marble fortresses of Fifth Avenue, the air was heavy with the scent of lilies and the oppressive silence of domestic failure. For Carolyn Astor, the maintenance of the Golden Cage was a technical operation that required the precision of a clockmaker and the budget of a small nation. By 1887, her husband, William Backhouse Astor Jr., had effectively removed himself from the social equation. He preferred the salt air and relative freedom of his steam yacht, the Ambassadress. This vessel was a marvel of late-century naval engineering, a 215-foot iron-hulled behemoth with a 1,200-horsepower steam engine capable of 14 knots. It required a full-time crew of 30 and cost $200,000 to construct, approximately $6.4 million in 2026. While Carolyn governed the 400 from her velvet throne, William spent months in the Caribbean or the Mediterranean, his absence a quiet, recurring scandal that Carolyn masked with increasingly elaborate rituals of tea and etiquette. The engineering of a Gilded Age woman's public appearance was a physically grueling process. Caroline and Alva were both patrons of Charles Frederick Worth, the father of haute couture in Paris. A single evening gown from Worth was a structural achievement, utilizing 20 to 30 pieces of precisely cut silk and satin, reinforced by a cage of whalebone, baleen corsetry. These garments were designed to reduce the waist to 18 inches, a feat of anatomical distortion that exerted up to 20 pounds of pressure per square inch on the internal organs. A standard ball gown cost $5,000 in 1888, roughly $165,000 in 2026 currency. To maintain the purity of these fabrics, the domestic logistics were staggering. A mansion like the Astors required a specialized laundry wing where steam-powered rollers pressed linens and where the chemical removal of stains was treated as an industrial secret. White kid leather gloves, of which a socialite might use 3 pairs in a single night, were cleaned with a volatile mixture of ammonia and lavender oil to mask the pungent scent of the cleaning agent. The macroeconomic reality of this period was the Great Deflation. Yet the cost of social maintenance rose exponentially. In 1889, the average American worker earned $400 a year, $13,000 today. In that same year, Alva Vanderbilt spent $11,000, nearly $360,000 today, simply on the floral arrangements for a dinner celebrating the arrival of a British duke. These flowers were hothouse grown in the Vanderbilt greenhouses in Islip, Long Island, where a staff of 20 gardeners manipulated steam pipes to simulate a tropical climate in the middle of a New York winter. This was the Golden Cage in its most literal sense, an artificial environment where the laws of nature and economics were suspended through the sheer application of capital. However, the psychological cost was becoming visible. Carolyn Astor's reliance on her social secretary and her obsession with the visiting card system became a form of neurosis. Every afternoon between 3:00 p.m. and 5:00 p.m., she would sit in her drawing room, waiting for cards to be delivered on a silver salver. The cards were sorted by rank. Those of the old guard were placed on top. The new money was often discarded before it reached her sight. In the Vanderbilt household, the cage was more volatile. Alva's husband, Willie Kay, was increasingly reckless with his infidelities, spending large sums on actresses and maintaining a secondary residence in the Tenderloin district of Manhattan. Alva countered this by pouring her energy into the Marble House in Newport, a $11 million and $358 million today structure that functioned as a temple to her own endurance. She was a woman who had traded her youth for a fortune, only to find that the fortune required a perpetual, exhausting performance. The gold that surrounded them was beginning to become the bars of their own prisons. By 1890, the conflict between the Astors and the Vanderbilts had moved from the ballroom to the newsstand. This was the era of yellow journalism, driven by the circulation wars between Joseph Pulitzer's New York World and William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal. These titans of media discovered that the private lives of the 400 were the ultimate commodity for a growing middle-class audience. Carolyn Astor, a woman of the pre-telegraph age, viewed the press with a cold, aristocratic disdain. She never granted interviews, believing that a lady's name should only appear in print upon her birth, her marriage, and her death. She maintained an impenetrable social mask of Victorian propriety, even as the world around her began to treat her as a museum piece. Alva Vanderbilt, however, was a modern strategist. She recognized that in a democratic society, power was not just about who you excluded, but who controlled the narrative. She began to use the media as a tactical weapon. She would leak descriptions of her guest lists and the cost of her menus to gossip columnists like those at Town Topics, a scandalous weekly edited by the infamous Colonel William Dalton Mann. Mann operated a sophisticated extortion racket. He would threaten to publish details of a family's infidelities unless they subscribed to his paper for exorbitant fees. Olva, rather than paying for silence, often provided him with information that made her rivals look provincial while framing her own events as the pinnacle of global sophistication. The cost of managing one's reputation in the 1890s, either through bribes or professional publicists, could reach $25,000 annually or $825,000 in 2026 terms. Behind the mask, the internal rot of these empires was accelerating. Willie K. Vanderbilt's affairs were no longer a private matter. They were being telegraphed to the world. In 1891, while Alva was organizing a reception for 500 guests, Willie was reportedly seen in Paris with a well-known courtesan, gifting her a diamond tiara worth $10,000, $330,000 today. For Alva, the mask was no longer a tool of social climbing. It was a shield against public pity. She compensated by increasing the rigidity of her household. Her daughter, Consuelo, was subjected to a regime of strict improvement, which included being forced to wear a steel rod strapped to her back during lessons to ensure a ducal posture. The technical pursuit of perfection was Alva's response to a husband who was increasingly absent and a social rival who refused to die. Macro-politically, the 1890s saw the rise of the progressive era and the first serious discussions of an income tax. To the public, the social mask of the elite was becoming a target of resentment rather than aspiration. The contrast between the starving tenements of the Lower East Side and the $100,000, $3.3 million today, dog dinner, hosted by a Vanderbilt associate, where pets were fed liver and rice on silver platters, was becoming politically dangerous. Carolyn Astor ignored these tremors, continuing her rituals in a house that felt increasingly like a tomb. She continued to host her annual January ball, but the faces were changing. The 400 was expanding to the 500, then the 1,000, as the sheer volume of American wealth diluted the exclusivity she had spent decades perfecting. In New York, a well-placed rumor was more lethal than a revolver, and Alva Vanderbilt was preparing to fire the most significant shot of all: the public destruction of her own marriage. In New York, a well-placed rumor was more lethal than a revolver. The year 1893 marked the arrival of a structural fracture in the American experiment. While the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago celebrated the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival with a white city powered by Tesla's alternating current, the financial foundations of the nation were liquefying. The bankruptcy of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad triggered the Panic of 1893, leading to the collapse of over 500 banks and the failure of 15,000 businesses. Unemployment soared to 19%. In the tenements of the Lower East Side, families were evicted into the slush of a brutal winter. Yet for Alva Vanderbilt and Carolyn Astor, the crisis was merely a backdrop for an escalation of their private architectural and social arms race. The Gilded Age was not a period of universal prosperity. It was an era where the insulation of extreme wealth became so thick that the screams of the starving could no longer penetrate the ballroom walls. In Newport, Rhode Island, the summer playground of the elite, Alva Vanderbilt was finalizing her most aggressive project yet, Marble House. Designed by Richard Morris Hunt and completed in 1892, the structure was a temple of white marble inspired by the Petit Trianon at Versailles. The technical specifications of Marble House were an affront to the economic reality of the era. Alva spent $11 million on its construction, a figure that translates to approximately $358 million in 2026. Of that sum, $7 million, nearly $230 million today, was spent exclusively on 500,000 cubic feet of white marble imported from Carrara, Italy, and Pennsylvania. The engineering required a dedicated pier to be built in Newport Harbor and a temporary railway line to transport the massive blocks to the construction site. Inside, the gold ballroom featured walls encrusted with 22-karat gold leaf and heavy bronze doors modeled after those at the Palais de Versailles. This was not a summer cottage. It was a limestone fortress designed to survive a revolution. The macroeconomic context of the 1893 panic served only to consolidate the power of the 400. As the Sherman Silver Purchase Act was repealed, and the gold reserves of the United States Treasury dwindled to a precarious $9 million, the Astors and Vanderbilts saw their relative purchasing power explode. While the common citizen saw their savings vanish, Carolyn Astor maintained her ritualistic residency at Beechwood, her own Newport estate. Beechwood was technically inferior to Marble House, relying on the older, more somber aesthetics of the mid-Victorian era, but it remained the social checkpoint. To be invited to Beechwood for the season was to be certified as human. However, the external pressure was mounting. Jacob Coxey's army, a protest march of unemployed workers, was descending on Washington, D.C., and the Pullman strike was about to paralyze the nation's rail lines. The very railroads that funded Alva's marble walls were becoming sites of labor warfare. Secondary figures in this drama began to buckle under the strain. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, Alva's brother-in-law, responded to her architectural provocation by building the Breakers, a 70-room Italian Renaissance palazzo that cost $7 million in 1895, roughly $230 million today. The sheer density of marble and steel in Newport became a physical manifestation of the elite's paranoia. They were building castles because, subconsciously, they knew the peasants were at the gates. Archive records from the Newport Historical Society reveal the staggering logistical costs of a single summer season. A typical cottage required 30 to 40 indoor servants, each paid roughly $20 to $50 per month, plus board. The laundry alone for a house like Marble House involved the daily cleaning of 400 pieces of linen, processed in a separate facility to keep the scent of boiling soap away from the mistress's nose. While the nation's currency was in question, the currency of Newport remained the orchid, the diamond, and the meticulously engraved invitation. The storm outside was real, but the war within the parlors was much more cruel. By 1895, the social war between Caroline Astor and Alva Vanderbilt had reached a stalemate that only a blood sacrifice could break. Alva, realizing that her new money could never fully eclipse the Astor lineage in America, looked toward the decaying aristocracy of Europe to secure a permanent victory. The target was the 9th Duke of Marlborough, Charles Spencer Churchill, known as Sonny. The Duke possessed the one thing Alva could not buy on Fifth Avenue, a title that dated back to 1702 and the ancestral seat of Blenheim Palace. To Alva, her daughter Consuelo was a tactical asset, a pawn to be traded for the ultimate social validation. Consuelo, a woman of legendary beauty and ducal posture, was secretly engaged to an American, Winthrop Rutherford. When Alva discovered the romance, she utilized a combination of psychological warfare and physical confinement. Archive accounts suggest Alva threatened to have a heart attack and die if Consuelo did not marry the Duke, even going as far as to hire private detectives to intercept Rutherford's letters. The technicalities of the marriage settlement, signed on November 6, 1895 at St. Bartholomew's Church, were essentially a corporate merger. The dowry provided to the Duke was $2,500,000 in the form of 50,000 shares of the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad. In 2026 value, this was a $82 million cash injection for the near-bankrupt Marlborough estate. In exchange, Alva Vanderbilt's daughter became a duchess, effectively placing the Vanderbilt name above the Astors in the global hierarchy of titles. The wedding itself was a display of industrial-scale luxury. Consuelo's dress featured a 5-yard train of Brussels lace that had taken dozens of lace makers months to complete, costing $7,000 in 1895, roughly $240,000 today. As the carriage pulled away from the Vanderbilt mansion, the crowds cheered, unaware that the bride was sobbing behind her veil. It was the dollar princess phenomenon at its most brutal. American steel and rail wealth being exported to repair the leaking roofs of British dukedoms. While the wedding captured the world's imagination, Alva was simultaneously executing a move that would permanently alienate her from Caroline Astor's 400. She filed for divorce from Willie K. Vanderbilt. In 1895, New York law only permitted divorce on the grounds of adultery, a charge that required public testimony and the total destruction of a family's reputation. For Caroline Astor, divorce was a moral contagion. It was a death that could not be mourned. She believed that a woman who divorced was no longer a lady and should be banished to the social wilderness. Alva, however, had spent years documenting Willie's infidelities with various actresses and his public appearances with Mrs. Nellie Neustretter in Paris. When the divorce was granted, Alva received a settlement of $100,000 per year, $3.3 million in 2026, and the ownership of Marble House. She had successfully extracted herself from a toxic marriage while retaining her fortune and her daughter's new ducal status. The macro-sociological impact of Alva's divorce was a seismic shift in American elite behavior. She proved that a woman with enough capital could defy the Knickerbocker moral code and survive. While Caroline Astor attempted to lead a total boycott of Alva, the younger generation of New York society, the New 400, began to side with the rebel. They were tired of Caroline's Victorian rigidity and were drawn to Alva's audacity. The divorce also marked a shift in the economy of marriage. It became a contract that could be dissolved rather than a sacrament that must be endured. Behind the scenes, Alva's next move was already in motion. She would marry Oliver Belmont, a man who was once her husband's closest friend. This was the ultimate betrayal of the social caste Caroline Astor had spent her life protecting. Alva was willing to burn her own house down to prove that she was the one holding the match. In the winter of 1896, the social fabric of New York underwent a violent restructuring that the traditional elite could neither prevent nor ignore. Alva Vanderbilt's marriage to Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont was more than a romantic scandal. It was a calculated breach of the 19th century moral infrastructure. Oliver Belmont was the son of August Belmont, the American representative of the Rothschild banking empire, and more importantly, he had been Willie K. Vanderbilt's closest friend. In the eyes of the Knickerbocker elite, this was not merely adultery, but a violation of the unspoken tribal codes of the patriarchy. Under the New York Code of Civil Procedure of the 1890s, divorce was a legal, civil death. A woman found guilty of adultery, or even one who proved her husband's guilt in a public forum, was technically allowed to retain her property, but was stripped of her social standing. Caroline Astor attempted to enforce this civil death by ordering a total blockade of Alva's new household. Any member of the 400 who accepted an invitation from the new Mrs. Belmont was summarily struck from the Astor list. However, Ulva countered this excommunication with the sheer gravity of her assets. She and Oliver Belmont established their primary seat at Belcourt in Newport, an architectural anomaly that cost $1,000 to construct in 1894, approximately $41,000 in 2026 currency. Designed again by Richard Morris Hunt, Belcourt was a 50,000 square foot structure modeled after the hunting lodges of Louis the Fiend. The technical ingenuity of the house was centered on Oliver's obsession with his horses. The entire first floor was a massive, climate-controlled stable for 30 prized horses, featuring specialized ventilation and drainage systems that cost $50,000, $2.1 million today. The horses slept on monogrammed linen sheets while the human residents occupied the upper floors. This was a deliberate middle finger to the correct social order. The engineering of Belcourt required a staff of 60 servants to manage the logistical friction of housing livestock and elite humans under one roof without the sense of the stable infiltrating the ballroom. Macroeconomically, the era was defined by the transition from the gold standard debates to the onset of the Spanish-American War. The massive capital surplus of the industrial titans began to fund a new kind of public narrative that made Caroline Astor's silence seem like a weakness. Ulva leveraged the new journalism of the era, feeding stories to the tabloid town topics. Colonel William Dalton Mann, the editor, utilized a sophisticated extortion system, but with Ulva, he found a symbiotic partner. Together, they publicized the empty chair dinners, where Ulva would set a table for 60 and have the press report on exactly which members of the old guard had failed to attend. This was social psychological warfare. She was outing her enemies in print, a tactic that Caroline Astor's Victorian brain could not process. The cost of maintaining this press-ready lifestyle, including press agents and private security to manage the paparazzi of the 1890s, exceeded $40,000 annually, or $1.6 million in 2026. As the legal battles over the Vanderbilt trusts concluded, Ulva emerged as one of the wealthiest independent women in the world. While Caroline Astor spent $15,000, $615,000 today, on a single January ball to maintain a dying hierarchy, Ulva was spending similar sums to fund the burgeoning suffrage movement. The struggle was no longer just about who was in the ballroom. It was about who defined the law. The battle moved from the courts of etiquette to the courts of the state. Caroline Astor's power was based on the unwritten rule, but Ulva Vanderbilt Belmont was learning that in a modern America, rules were meant to be rewritten or bought. Caroline won the battle for the moral high ground, but she realized too late that the ground itself was being sold from under her feet. The year 1900 signaled the structural decay of the Astor dynasty. The most significant blow did not come from a Vanderbilt, but from within the Astor bloodline. William Waldorf Astor, Caroline's nephew, was embroiled in a bitter dispute over the title of the Mrs. Astor. When Caroline refused to yield the title to his wife Mary, William decided to raze his family mansion next door to Caroline's 34th Street residence. In its place, he built the original Waldorf Hotel, a 13-story spite building designed by Henry Janeway Hardenberg. The Waldorf was an architectural weapon designed to render Caroline's home uninhabitable. It towered over her private garden, with windows that allowed thousands of transient hotel guests to peer directly into her windows. The technical specifications of the Waldorf were revolutionary. It was one of the first hotels to feature complete electricity and open plumbing in every room. The construction cost was $5,000, roughly $205,000 in 2026. Caroline Astor was forced to abandon her fortress. In 1894, she followed the Vanderbilts north, commissioning the construction of a new mansion at 840 Fifth Avenue. This palace, designed by Richard Morris Hunt in the French Renaissance style, cost $500,000, $62 million today, and featured a ballroom that could hold 200 people. However, the move was a symbolic defeat. She was now living in a neighborhood Ulva Vanderbilt had defined. As the mansion was being completed, the macroeconomic panic of 1907 began to loom, and the gilded nature of the era was being scrutinized by muckraker journalists like Ida Tarbell. The public was no longer fascinated by the 400. They were suspicious of them. Real estate taxes on Fifth Avenue mansions rose by 300% in a decade, making the maintenance of these castles a financial liability even for the Astors. Psychologically, the Queen was fading. Following the death of her husband in 1890 and the increasing isolation of her new mansion, Caroline Astor began to show signs of what modern medicine would diagnose as Alzheimer's or vascular dementia. In the early 1900s, this was simply referred to as softening of the brain. In her final years, the woman who had meticulously vetted every person in New York society lived in a state of perpetual hallucination. She would dress herself in her full-state regalia, her Beecher diamonds, now worth $94 million in 2026 terms, and her dark blue velvet worth gowns, and descend her grand staircase at midnight. She would stand at the entrance of her empty ballroom, greeting a line of phantom guests. She would hold conversations with the long-dead Ward McAllister, asking him to ensure that the Duke of Marlborough was seated to her right. The logistics of her care were managed by a phalanx of silent nurses and footmen who were paid discretion bonuses of $1,000, $41,000 today, to never speak of the Queen's decline. While Caroline spoke to ghosts, Alva Vanderbilt Belmont was speaking to the future. In 1909, Alva transformed Marble House from a temple of exclusion into a headquarters for the political revolution. She founded the Political Equality Association and used her vast wealth to fund the National Woman's Party. She hosted suffrage teas in her Chinese tea house, an elaborate pagoda built on the edge of the Newport Cliffs. The tea house was a marvel of chinoiserie engineering, utilizing traditional joinery and vibrant lacquers that cost $50,000, $2.1 million today, to import and assemble. Alva was no longer interested in the 400. She was interested in the millions of women who were demanding the right to vote. The woman who once fought for a seat at the Astor table was now fighting to dismantle the table entirely. The Queen was dying in a kingdom that no longer existed, while her rival was building a new republic. The Queen was dying in a kingdom that no longer existed. On the afternoon of October 30th, 1908, the heavy silk curtains were drawn at 845th Avenue. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, the woman who had functioned as the central processing unit of American social life for nearly 4 decades, had ceased to breathe. Her death at age 78 was not merely a biological conclusion, it was the final decommissioning of a social operating system that had become incompatible with the 20th century. The technical arrangements for her funeral were handled with the same clinical precision she had applied to her dinner parties. Her mahogany casket, lined with tufted white satin and fitted with heavy silver handles, cost $10,000 in 1908, a sum that translates to $352,000 in 2026. As the funeral cortege moved toward Trinity Church, the city of New York witnessed the passing of the Knickerbocker ghost. The streets were no longer dominated by the rhythmic clatter of carriage horses, but by the dissonant chugging of internal combustion engines. In 1908, Henry Ford introduced the Model T, an engineering milestone that would do more to democratize American life and destroy the exclusivity of the 400 than any Vanderbilt ball. The macroeconomic reality of the Astor estate at the time of her death was staggering. Caroline left behind a personal fortune and real estate holdings valued at roughly $150 million, an equivalent to $5.2 billion in 2026. This wealth was anchored in the Astor Trust, a complex legal instrument designed to prevent the fragmentation of assets across generations. However, the leadership of the family now fell to her son, John Jacob Astor IV. Jack Astor was a man of the new century, an amateur inventor who held patents for a bicycle brake and a pneumatic road improver. Yet he would soon become the central figure in a scandal that would have horrified his mother. In 1911, he divorced his wife, Ava Willing, and married 18-year-old Madeline Force. The social blowback was a localized hurricane. Jack was forced to flee to Europe to escape the scrutiny of the very 400 his mother had spent her life protecting. The technical enforcement of social morality was failing. Even an Astor could no longer ignore the shift toward individual autonomy over dynastic duty. The final act of the Astor dynasty's Gilded Age dominance was written in cold Atlantic seawater. On April 15, 1912, Jack Astor stood on the deck of the RMS Titanic. The ship itself was the ultimate technical metaphor for the era. 46,000 tons of steel, powered by 29 boilers and 2 reciprocating engines designed to be unsinkable through a system of 16 watertight bulkheads. The engineering failed because the bulkheads did not extend high enough to prevent a domino effect of flooding. Jack Astor, the wealthiest man on the ship with a fortune of nearly $5 billion in today's money, was crushed by the falling forward funnel as the ship foundered. When his body was recovered, he was identified by the initials JJA sewn into his jacket and the $2,500 in cash, $88,000 today, found in his pockets. The death of the Astor heir marked the literal sinking of the Gilded Age's confidence in its own invincibility. While the Astors were being reclaimed by the sea and the soil, Alva Vanderbilt Belmont was witnessing the obsolescence of her own creations. The massive mansions on Fifth Avenue were becoming logistical nightmares. The technical cost of heating a 50,000 square foot limestone palace using coal-fired boilers had become astronomical, exceeding $20,000 annually, $700,000 today. Furthermore, the domestic labor market was shifting. The servant class was disappearing into the factories of the industrial North, where the wages were higher and the hours more predictable. Alva's sister-in-law, Alice Vanderbilt, was forced to close the upper floors of her 137-room mansion because she could no longer find the 37 servants required to maintain them. The infrastructure of excess was collapsing under its own weight. The throne was empty, but the ruins of the palace would tell the real story. The extinction of the Gilded Age was not a sudden event, but a slow grinding of economic and legislative tectonic plates. In 1913, the ratification of the 16th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution introduced the federal income tax, followed closely by the Revenue Act of 1916, which established the estate tax. These were the technical executioners of the great American fortunes. No longer could wealth like the Vanderbilts or the Astors be passed intact through the blood and steel model. The tax rate on the largest estates eventually reached 77%, a fiscal pressure that forced the liquidation of the great palaces. By 1925, Alva Vanderbilt's Petit Chateau at 660 Fifth Avenue, the white limestone fortress that had brought Carolyn Astor to her knees, was sold for its land value and demolished to make way for a commercial office building. The wrecking ball, a 5,000-pound iron sphere, reduced the hand-carved Caen stone and Richard Morris Hunt's Gothic tracery to 20,000 tons of generic debris in less than 60 days. The fragmentation of the Vanderbilt fortune remains one of the most significant case studies in the thermodynamics of wealth. In 1973, 120 descendants of Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt gathered for a family reunion at Vanderbilt University. In a room filled with the bloodline of the man who was once wealthier than the U.S. government, not a single millionaire remained. The $200 million fortune of 1877, $6, $2 billion in 2026, had been evaporated by inheritance taxes, extravagant spending, and the failure to adapt to the transition from rail to air and automotive transport. The technical entropy of wealth is absolute. Without the constant input of new capital, the friction of time eventually reduces every empire to zero. Alva Vanderbilt's personal legacy shifted from the ballroom to the ballot box. She died in Paris in 1933, having spent the final third of her life and her remaining millions funding the militancy of the woman's suffrage movement. Her funeral was the first for a woman to be honored with a Guard of Honor by the National Woman's Party. Carolyn Astor's legacy suffered a different kind of erasure. Her mansion at 840 Fifth Avenue was sold by her son's estate and demolished in 1926. The Beecher diamond necklace, that $94 million armor of light, was broken up, and the individual stones sold to various anonymous buyers across the globe. The 400 list was replaced by the social register and eventually by the celebrity culture of Hollywood and the influencer economy of the late 20th century. Status was no longer a fortress of exclusion, but a commodity of mass consumption. Today, the sites of the Great War between Alva and Caroline are occupied by luxury retail flagship stores and hedge fund headquarters. The only physical remnants are the summer cottages of Newport, preserved as museums where tourists pay $30 to walk across the marble floors Alva once used as a battlefield. These houses are no longer homes. They are the tax-exempt mausoleums of a vanished species. The war between Caroline Astor and Alva Vanderbilt was never really about a guest list or a ballroom quadrille. It was a struggle to define the soul of American power, whether it would be a static aristocracy of lineage or a dynamic, ruthless meritocracy of capital. Caroline represented the past, a world of slow, landed stability. Alva represented the future, a world of rapid industrial disruption. In the end, the engine of American capitalism consumed them both. The limestone turned to dust, the silk rotted in the dark, and the diamonds were scattered to the four winds. In the obsessive quest to be the guardians of immortality, the queens of the Gilded Age discovered that the gold shines forever, but the hands that hold it are always destined for the dust.